Hey guys, welcome back to a brand new video here on the channel, and today it's finally here, my spoiler-free review of Rebel Moon Part 2, the Scargiver. We obviously had Rebel Moon Part 1 back in December. Again, very fortunate enough to be working with Netflix on Part 1 and Part 2. Part 1 saw me in Japan, and I definitely did have a few issues with the first film in terms of a narrative standpoint, and it's definitely carried over into Part 2. Now, let me just get straight into it. Did I enjoy Part 2 more than Part 1? Absolutely. To me, it actually felt like a completely different film. I know they filmed Part 1 and Part 2 back to back. It's essentially one giant 5-hour film just split into two, but there was just something about it in terms of the concepts, the designs, the CGI. Like, I know Zach's eventually going to release his big grandiose R-rated cut of both Part 1 and 2, and whether or not he fuses them together, I'm not sure what's going to be happening at this stage. But I definitely, I sound like Cork. That's me, hey bro. But I definitely found more enjoyment in Part 2. Is it a perfect movie? No. But a lot of my gripes have carried over from Part 1. That's what I was worried about. So again, this is going to be a spoiler-free review, but at the same time, there are little elements here and there that I may touch on that you may consider a spoiler. So if you were going into this completely blind, haven't watched trailers, anything, maybe go watch the film and then come back and watch this review. So in Rebel Moon Part 2, we see Korra and the surviving warriors prepare to defend Velt, their new home. It's nice, got good views. Alongside his people against the realm, the warriors face their past, revealing their motivations before the realm's forces arrive to crush the growing rebellion. Obviously, we see the resurrection of Atticus Noble, played by Ed Skrein, who once again is just absolute batshit crazy and just pure evil in Part 2. He carries that performance over into Part 2 from Part 1, but I think he's a lot more meaner, he's a lot more brutal in this film. If some of you watch my interview with Ed and the rest of the cast, I said at one point, you are tearing through people like a bull in a china shop. His physicality is scary to look at. He's lean, he's sinewy, he's frightening. You can see the man's skull protruding through his head at one point. That's how fucking lean he was. And I'm assuming he leaned up as much as he could leading up to that particular scene when he's resurrected and he doesn't have his shirt on. He's just got like a loincloth. And then for the rest of the film, he's in a uniform. But my God, he's got hungry looking at him. And not because he's a fine specimen. Now for this video, I figured I'd get my negatives out of the way. A lot of my gripes come from a narrative standpoint, a writing standpoint, and a dialogue standpoint. Being that this is the film where the giant battle takes place between the rebels and the realm's forces, I figured they would just get straight into it. But the first act is a very tough slog and slows the pace of the film right down. We get a lot more exposition dumping between the core group. And I figured we could do that in Part 1, but you got to understand, and if you guys have seen Part 1, at the end of Part 1, they've only just really all come together at the climax in the film when they are indeed taking on Atticus Noble. So we do have a bit of housekeeping to do in terms of them bonding together. At the beginning of this film, I just feel like it could have been handled a lot better. It includes a scene with all of them in a barn, the core crew, including Korra, Titus, Tarek, and they're going through some of their backstories, some of their secrets, some of the skeletons in their closets to kind of get to know each other a bit better before this battle goes down, just so they are battle hardened with one another. And they essentially just get to know one another a lot more. And it just dragged on way too long. We go from one character to the other and we hear their backstory. Granted, with Tarek's backstory, the imagery was so on point, intriguing, badass. It made me want to see a whole movie dedicated to Tarek's backstory. And Part 2 to me, I wouldn't say it's Zack Snyder's magnum opus in terms of visuals, but it just seems like himself, the concept designers, the artisans, the costumers, everyone has just gone all out because there are some incredible visuals in this film. And I feel like I said, the CGI has definitely been improved upon from Part 1. There are a lot of shots in Part 1 I'm like, ooh, buddy, you could have done another 15-hour render on that. Whereas this one, I don't know if they've gone back to the drawing board and they've tightened up a few things here and there, but everything looks incredible. But going back to the writing and the dialogue, again, it's very heavy-handed with its exposition dumping, just trying to get more information out of these characters about their backstory so they all know each other. I just felt it could have been tidied up, tightened up, and wrapped up a lot quicker, or just completely unnecessary. But it's that double-edged sword for that matter, where we need a bit more backstory on them to buy into the fact that these are a solid crew all working together for the greater good. So it's one of those things, you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. I don't know if you guys agree once you see part 2, but yeah, to me, it just dragged on a lot. And also amongst all that, before we see them training the farmers and the ground crew, it is a bit of a slog. I figured it'd be one of those things where we play a little catch up, get a, previously on. It was just a bit of a snail's pace for the first act. Now, when it comes to the end battle, it's a solid hour plus change, and it's incredible. It definitely makes up for the snail's pace first act. I loved what I witnessed, what I saw, what I heard in that final battle, and I feel like every character in the core crew that's fighting against the bigger guy, they all get their time to shine with some incredibly choreographed fight scenes, some great visuals, and yes, there are instances where you see something you're like, oh my god, that's very Star Wars, like the knockoff lightsabers, the mention of the rebellion and stuff like that. Before I wrap up my negatives, there was one decision at the climax of the film made by a character, obviously won't give anything away, and to me it just felt so slapdash considering the subject matter was carried over from part 1, and it was just such a pivotal choice from part 1. And I thought, oh shit, okay, this is gonna carry over. And it was just a decision that was just made in like 5 seconds, disregard, and I thought, is that lazy, or you just need to get that out of the way? Again, trying to be as vague as possible, but to me it just didn't seem right or natural, and it was just a kind of a slapdash. We just need to resolve that issue, and then we can get back to what's going on. And I think going back to that scene where it's a very drawn out backstory for everyone, it definitely does bring them together. Again, I just think it could have been handled a bit better. But I feel like everyone dug deep in part 2, even though they all filmed it in one hit. The performances on a whole, like across the board, are pretty solid. I will give props to Sofia Boutella. The very end sequence, there is something that happens and she is wailing, and I'm like, man, like, you sold that so well. And I said that in my interview with her and McKeel. I wasn't blowing smoke. I wasn't being full of shit. I'm like, it made the watery things happen because you sold it to me with that performance. But also actor Stasna as Tarek, like I said, when we see his backstory, when there's that big exposition dumping and backstory scene, again, I love the visuals from his homeworld. It looks so intriguing, gloomy, gothic, and just his people, his culture. I loved all that. But there's a sequence within that backstory, within that flashback sequence, that is so disturbing, sad, and the restraint in his face. You see his face quivering with what has just happened, what he has just witnessed, and I thought, that is a damn good performance right there. I feel like everyone just has peppered little bits of greatness throughout this film. And Djimon Hounsou, you can just always rely on him to turn in a damn good performance. And like I said in my interview with him, just a stoic father figure, delivers a crackerjack monologue to everyone on the ground before they start training them. I think another issue I have, and like it's just one of those things you can't really do anything about it, is the fact that part 1 and part 2 won't have a cinematic run. They may down the track with the R-rated cuts of the film, I don't know, but I've seen part 2 twice, I've seen part 1 once. I've seen them both instances in a cinema, and the sound design was incredible. They would blow your fucking head off, like that end battle sequence in part 2. It's just a shame people aren't going to be able to experience that. Like, if you have a great sound system, a great setup, awesome, you're good to go. But some people that just have their telly like me, you're not going to get the proper sound quality that the sound designers have accomplished with this film. So part 2 is definitely a mixed bag for me, guys. Like, I definitely enjoyed it more than part 1. That end battle sequence, like I said, that goes for an hour plus change, great, satisfying ending, a sad ending at that at one point. The action just gets more and more bombastic. It gives all the characters time to breathe with each part of the battle going on. I kind of equate it to the end of episode 1, The Phantom Menace, the end battle on Naboo, and then you see the Duel of the Fates with Qui-Gon, Obi-Wan, and Darth Maul. Like, it's going back and forth between all these groups, and it's pretty much the same part 2 of Rebel Moon. Like, gives every character a chance to breathe, have their moment, have their 15 minutes of fame. And also, speaking of 15 minutes of fame, Jimmy, voiced by Anthony Hopkins, he has his time to shine. He is a fucking badass. The CGI on him is brilliant. There was one shot where he lands inside a tank, like he rips the roof off a tank and jumps inside, and I'm like, ooh, could have done with another 15 hours of rendering on that one. But the rest of him, when he's interacting with the actors, looks great. Like, it's legit. Again, the CGI just feels so much more improved upon in part 2. I don't know if they've gone back and just improved upon things, tightened things up, but with that first act, it's quite slow. I didn't expect it to be that slow. The dialogue at times is a little bit slapdash and a little bit, you could have worded that a bit better. And it's just one of those things where, and this is not a dig at all, I think Zack Snyder just needs to capitalize on his strengths, which is visuals, designs, concept designs, costumes, props, the way he includes himself in and amongst those talented artisans, and when they all work together, they make magic. I just don't feel writing is his strongest point of filmmaking, and there's nothing wrong with that. I can't write for shit. That's why I leave that to other people when we do fan films and stuff like that. I know how to throw dirt and shoe polish at something and do a damn good job. And I just think it's one of those things where there's no harm in taking a back seat when it comes to writing. Leave it to someone else. Because I feel like if the writing had been so tight and on point and just flowed a lot better, this would have been an absolute fucking masterpiece. Because you have all these wonderful visuals. The end battle sequence, there's this tank that looks like a rhino and it's like exerting all this black soot, and it's just, it sounds like a wailing whale, and just the way it moves, I'm like, that's badass. That's metal. I love shit like that. The uniforms are designed brilliantly. And I do apologize if this review is all over the shop. I've got a shitload of notes. I'm just trying to tick everything off and just try and get my message out there to you guys. So guys, in the end, Rebel Moon Part 2 does indeed topple Part 1 for me, in my opinion. Though it does veer off course a little in the first act with some unneeded backstories and exposition dumping, but at the same time, you kind of need them for these guys to be a tight crew to go up against the big guy. But it makes up for it with a solid end battle that's sure to satisfy people's carnage cravings. I feel like the cast and crew really dug deep, even though this is all filmed in one hit. Again, by no means a perfect film, but I found a lot of enjoyment in it once the end battles started. It was what I came here for. Again, once the going gets going, we see an entertaining climax paired with some great visuals, sound design. Now the door has indeed been left open for the story to continue, so I'm guessing that Zack Snyder and co are seeing how Part 2 goes and whether or not they are indeed going to continue that story. But no disrespect at all, but I feel like Zack, just take a back seat in the writing department and just go ahead and do your visuals, man, because you were the director of photography for Part 1 and 2, and the films look incredible. And the concept designs, the elements that have been injected into the end battle with some great looking tanks, uniforms, creatures, prosthetic designs. When you team up with these talented artisans, you make magic in that area. To me anyway. I know he has his naysayers, but you gotta understand guys, this guy means a lot to me, but at the same time, I just think he needs to realize his strengths and his weaknesses. The film's streaming on Netflix, so like, what have you got to lose? If you've seen Part 1, I highly encourage you to watch Part 2 just to wrap everything up and see where the story possibly could go. Again, you're not paying for admission, you're just paying for a streaming service, so I reckon check it out. Just make sure you got a damn good sound system, because that end battle hits hard. Make sure that sub's cranked up. So guys, in the end, I'm going to be giving Rebel Moon Part 2 3.5 sweaty and sleep-deprived interviewers out of 5. So guys, once you have seen Star Wars, the Scargiver, I mean Rebel Moon Part 2, drop a comment below and let me know your thoughts. I think it was an improvement over Part 1, even though they filmed these in one hit. Love you guts, and I'll catch you in the next one.